Good evening. Next week is Hanukkah, so let me just tell you now and at the end that there'll be no class next week, and then we continue for 2 more classes with the help of God afterwards. So what we want to do now is, it's really a momentous moment, because we are beginning the tragic second half of the book of Genesis, Sefer Bereshit. Vayeshev Yaakov. Ironically enough, the terrible story of Yosef, terrible on many levels. It's about a split in the family, it's about hatred, it's about jealousy, it's about fratricide, and it's about exile, ultimately. Because of this story, the family has to leave Eretz Canaan and go off for unnumbered years into the persecutions of Egypt. And the whole story begins, ironically enough, with the word Vayeshev. The word Vayeshev, can you hear me well? Yes? No. The word Vayeshev, of course, means he settled down. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz Canaan. And Yaakov settled down in the land of Canaan. And what is the land? I'm sorry, not quite. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz megurei Aviv be'eretz Canaan. He settled down in the land where his father had been a ger. Eretz megurei Aviv. In the land that his father had also lived in, but under the different conditions of not being settled, but being usually translated as sojourner, an outsider of some kind, someone who's not at home. And that's a kind of interesting sidelight on Yitzchak. That even though Yitzchak spends his whole life in Eretz Canaan, and he never goes abroad, he has no taste of exile at all, nevertheless, even as he is in Eretz Canaan, in some way he is just sojourning. He doesn't achieve that depth of really being there, the security, I don't know how one is supposed to imagine it, but Yaakov does. And Yaakov, ironically, now begins this last part of his life, these painful, 20-odd years in which his son will be lost to him, followed by 17 years in exile in Egypt. That's going to be the rest of his life. And he begins that whole last part of his life with the word Vayeshev. He settled down. So how do we read this? Do we read it ironically? Right, so that it's possible, it's a literary text, and that we are supposed to feel the irony of that Vayeshev, that he settled down, but how much of a settling down can that be? But nevertheless, that's the word that's used. And in order to deal with that word, we're going to be looking at Rashi, we're going to be seeing, doing some studying, to see how the classic commentaries have dealt with the issue of being settled when you are just about to become extremely unsettled. What does that pick up from the life of Yaakov and somewhere the ongoing story of Yaakov? Yeshuvehem v'gilgulehem. We'll come to it in a minute. I want to interrupt now, and I'm really talking about interruptions tonight. I'm talking about invasions of strange material. I want to interrupt by telling a story, which is the story of the book and the film on which the title is based. I called this talk Letter from an Unknown Woman. And as some of you may recognize it, it is the name of a short novel, a long short story, written by Stefan Zweig, at the beginning of the 20th century, Letter from an Unknown Woman. And it was made into a very famous and successful film, which is now hard to get hold of, but called Letter from an Unknown Woman, made by Max Ophüls in the 1950s. And I want to start, although it seems to have nothing to do with our subject at all, I want to start by telling the story of the film. I'm thinking about the film particularly. The film begins with a scene of a man opening a letter. He gets a letter and he opens the letter from the unknown woman. And then there's a flashback and we go back into the whole history. The history is of a young woman who from childhood has been fascinated by and in love with a neighbor in her apartment building who is a famous and very attractive pianist. I mean, it's unfair, but that's how it is. So she is in love with him, and of course he doesn't pay any attention to her. She's a child, and then she grows up and she becomes a pretty young woman, And they meet and they start an affair. I suppose that was the word for it, a relationship. They start a relationship, it seems very romantic, and then he just leaves. He has other things to do. And leaves her pregnant. He doesn't realize she's pregnant. And so she goes through this whole period of her life. She meets a wealthy man who wants to marry her. And so she gains security and a home for herself and her child. And all is well until she meets the lover again, the pianist again. And he wants to start a relationship with her, never recognizing her from the past. He doesn't realize that this is the same woman. For whatever reason, that's how the story goes. And so he wants to start a new relationship. And she refuses, although she's tempted. She refuses, and you feel the depth of her own feelings. And then she gets sick and she dies. And before she dies, she writes him a letter from an unknown woman, in which she tells him the story of her life, simply tells him the story of her life with him. And the film begins with his reading the letter, and then there's the flashbacks, and then we come back to that moment of him reading the letter, and he looks up from the letter with an expression, a kind of incalculable expression on his face, appalled, horrified, bewildered. Something has invaded his life now. This woman who was for him an unknown woman that he was attracted to, who he knew very well, who he was very intimate with, but who remained an intimate stranger, so that he didn't recognize her when he met her again. And something about that strangeness, that uncanniness of his own experience, how could he not know all these, you see on his face. And it has to do with the role of the unknown woman, the intimate stranger. And I'm not going to give you any hints about how this might possibly relate to the story of Yaakov and Rachel and Yosef, except that I've just given you a hint. You know in which direction to look. And if you so please, it's really up to you. You can bear in mind this story and try to find a home for it. You know, what did the teacher mean when she put that as the title of the story? What's the connection? I may not return to it officially, but I hope the penny will drop. And I come back. I'm sorry?
Why did he leave her in the first place? Is that clear?
Why did the man leave her? Well, because he's a flighty spirit. You know, he has other. You know, it's all very well in its time, but. Okay, this is, a certain kind of drama, melodrama. It's a very beautiful film, if you get a chance to see it. And so I come back to Yaakov settling down. And Yaakov settles down, and this is what Rashi has to say about the problem of the beginning of the parsha. Yaakov settled, Vayeshev Yaakov. And the text goes on, Ele toldot Yaakov, Yosef. These are the children of Yaakov, Yosef. And then we don't hear about any other children by name. There's no list of children. You'd think these are the children of Yaakov, Kolon, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. There should be a whole list of the children. No, it's Yosef. Yosef was 17 years old. And I'm going to summarize the first part of this. Just have a look at the opening of number 1. Rashi translates, these are the children of Yaakov, but this is the history of the children of Yaakov. Toldot can also mean history, the story, the chronicles. This is a story of the children of Yaakov. Ele yeshuvehem v'gilgulehem. These are their settlings and their unsettlings. Gilgul is their ups and downs, their vicissitudes. That is, their settlings doesn't mean that Yaakov settled down. It means he began a process of being settled and being unsettled, of being in your place and not being in your place, being exiled. And that's a story, I don't know when it comes to an end, but Rashi says, until they would arrive at a place that can be called Yeshuv. In the end, hopefully, that is the hope, that in the end they will Vayeshev. But it's a process, and the process includes its opposite. that as you're moving towards that serene, happy ending, you're going to go through a number of adventures, to put it like that. And they're very grave adventures, like what's waiting now with Yosef. Now, Rashi then adds, he goes on to say, he says, this is the pshat of the text. This is no midrash, this is just a plain reading. It can't just mean he settled down. It has to mean he entered into that whole part of history, which is called the process of settling down, which is a complicated story. It's not at all a simple story, and it includes its opposite. And there's something, this is just like life, you're supposed to think. But then he goes on to quote a number of Midrashic sources, and here I'm not going to dwell on it, but I'm going to go right to the end of the passage. The last Midrashic source he brings to bear on the word Vayeshev. V'od nidrash bo, it's about 3 lines from the end in the Hebrew. Vayeshev, how do you read he settled down? And this is through the lens of the Midrash. Bikesh Yaakov leshev b'shalva. Yaakov sought to settle down in peace. He aimed at tranquility, shalva. Beautiful word, it's not just peace. Shalva. It goes together with shalom in some ways, almost the same letters. But what is the... let me finish here. He sought, he desired, he aimed to settle down in peace. Kafatz alav rogzo shel Yosef. There leapt upon him the outrage of the story of Yosef. And there's no connection between the two. On the one hand, you have his desire, and on the other hand, you have what actually happened. The gap between desire and reality. And it's a very shocking haiku almost. You know, it's in poetic form. Just listen to the beat. Yeah? Bikesh Yaakov leshev b'shalva, kafatz alav rogzo shel Yosef. And there you are, without any attempt to make sense of it. That's just what happened. What has Rashi just done to the word Vayeshev? Vayeshev is a statement. He settled down. And he doesn't here have recourse to the common sense view that it means he began the process of settling down. That's within rational discourse to talk like that. Here we're talking a different discourse, in a way a psychoanalytic discourse. It's a discourse about the world of desire, which is the inner world of a human being. When it says he settled, it means he set his mind on settling. His great desire was to settle. So what Rashi has just done is undermine the plain meaning of the word Vayeshev. He's actually saying Vayeshev means the opposite of Vayeshev. To settle down in the Torah means, if it includes the inner world of the person, it means that he had his heart set on settling down in tranquility, and he didn't achieve it. If you seek something, the word levakesh almost includes its opposite. Do you see what I mean? If you are seeking for something, it means you're not finding it. Bikashtiv v'lo mitzativ in Shir HaShirim, the great love story. There's a love story that's based on that principle of eros, of the erotic, where you long, you reach out for something and it disappears as you're reaching out for it. Of course, you could translate bikashtiv v'lo mitzativ. I'm just pointing out the nuance here. I'm choosing to translate it, and I think it's the truer translation. I sought him and I could not find him. As if that's part of seeking, is not finding. But you could, if you're more optimistic and your life experience has been more hopeful, you might translate it, I sought him, but I didn't find him. Do you see the difference? But I didn't find him. It means I had a right to expect that I would find him, but it so happened that I didn't. So it's not so totally, what can I say, tragic. But there's something here about Yaakov mivakesh something, and a terrible fate leaping upon him. Kafatz alav. What a violent image. There's a verb there that demands that you imagine. What leaps in imagination? What do you imagine if you allow your imagination to go? There leapt upon him. All right, it was the story of Yosef, but what's the immediate image? An animal, yeah. Isn't that the obvious image? A wild animal. Chayara'a. Something violent is waiting to leap. Call it an animal. Do you remember the beast in the jungle from last week? How many of you were here last week? Okay. Okay, I'm not going to repeat what I said last week, so you should feel bad for not being here last week. But that was Henry James's story, and it had something to do with the leaping of beasts. We'll see if I get kinder in the course of the evening. And here, what do you have in the Midrash then? In the Midrash, you read this then. Tzadikim mevakshim leshev b'shalva. The righteous, in general, seek to settle down in peace. So suddenly, it's not only Yaakov who has this idiosyncrasy that he desires to settle down in peace. It's a general statement about righteous people. Generically, righteous people, this is their dream of a life of shalva, a life of serenity. And when that happens, God says to them, it's not enough for you what's prepared for you in the world to come, but you also want to settle down in peace in this world? Now that's the rather sobering, to put it mildly, sentiment of the Midrash. And I remember, as a child learning this as one of those Rashis that just sticks in my mind from childhood. And I remember being very upset about it then. I fully expected to find shalva and happy endings and so on. What child doesn't? You're brought up on fairy tales and legends of all kinds, and the happy end is obviously part of it. And a religious faith, in a way, seems to promise the same thing. And here comes Rashi and the Midrash, going in deeper, I would say, going in beyond the myth, and questioning peace in this world? That's the question that God asks here. Yes, in another world, yes. In this world, it's what the philosophers call a category error. It means, you've got your category of worlds wrong. In this world, you can't expect leshev b'shalva. And we're left wondering why. So what would be so bad? What would be so unexpected? And so on. Now, so Yaakov is in some way wrong-minded in his desire to settle down in peace, leshev b'shalva. And this terrible thing happens to him in a way to put him right, to say you've got the wrong idea. With this, I want to go to the next Midrash. And the next Midrash, unlike this one, generations of Jews have taken in Rashi with their mother's milk, I like to say. Anyone who knew anything knew Rashi on the Parsha throughout the generations. Of course, not many generations had very learned people, but I still want to say that. But this Midrash now is unpublished. It's an unpublished Midrash, which was simply reprinted in a compendium of Midrashic sources called Torah Shlema, and that's where you can find it. It has something like 30-odd volumes going through the whole Torah, a very, very detailed account of Midrashic sources on each verse. And so this is where you find this, and I find it fascinating. Vayeshev Yaakov settled down. Rabbi Elazar said, what does that teach us, Vayeshev Yaakov? What are we supposed to get out of it? Shechashav Yaakov bedato. So here the interpretation begins. Yaakov thought in his mind, what an opening, that Yaakov had a thinking process. Yaakov has an intellectual life of some kind, in which he thinks to himself, as we would say. He thinks to himself, and what does he think? It turns out to be a very literary and philosophical thought about his life and God's promises. What does he think to himself? He remembers the covenant between the pieces. Brit Ben Abitarim in chapter 15, where God appeared in a vision to Abraham and said to him, your children will be sojourners, outsiders, strangers in a land that doesn't belong to them. Ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem. So it's a kind of sinister prevision of the future, where God tells Abraham, your children are going to have to go through the mill, and they're going to serve that strange nation. They're going to be enslaved. And there's another word there that I've forgotten, which was the third verb that's used there. And in the end, they will leave with much property. And of course, we read this and we understand that it refers to the Egyptian exile. And it's a kind of prophecy of the inevitable, you'll be going down to Egypt and you'll have to go through all that, and so on. But in the end, there'll be a happy ending. But Yaakov reads the text, and he does a very lucid explication de text. Something we know about reading literary texts. He says, look, the word ger is used there about that terrible future. I've been a ger already in my life. It's written in the Torah that Yaakov says, im Lavan garti. I have been a sojourner with Lavan. The word to work for someone, to be enslaved by someone. I've gone through that myself. And the third verb as well. In other words, what is Yaakov? He comes to an educated, informed opinion now, which is based thoroughly on the text. And he says, look, the pshat of the text, the obvious meaning of the text, I have actually lived that out in my own life. That means that's the end of history. I don't have to worry about my children anymore. Now we begin the plain sailing. I've left as a rich man, even that. I left it with much possessions. I left the house of Lavan with a lot of sheep and goats, and so on. And so it's all fulfilled. So he reads the text very carefully. He comes to a perfectly satisfactory interpretation. And of course, it's particularly satisfactory because it exonerates his children from having to go through all that. And when he thinks this, what happens to him? As nityashva da'ato. Then his mind settles down. What an expression. That's the meaning of Vayeshev. Vayeshev Yaakov is not a kind of bourgeois settling down at a certain point after your turbulent life. It's the settling down of the mind. And it's at the heart of it, there is what the rabbis regard as a particular virtue of a wise person, of a chacham. If you want to be a chacham or a chachama, then what you should cultivate is yeshuv hadat, the settled mind. And what is the settled mind, right? It's not what you might think it is. It doesn't mean a stodgy mind, right? Although in somewhere it links up. What is the settled mind? What is the virtue of yeshuv hadat? Anyone? Can anyone offer a translation? What do they mean when they say you should cultivate yeshuv hadat? It doesn't mean serenity in itself, because that's an emotional thing. I'm talking about an intellectual virtue, a cognitive virtue. Yes, something like that. That you live in a world of contradictions. You live in a world in which things are pulling you in different directions. If you're giving advice to someone, let's say, someone comes with a problem to you, and they tell you the whole story. There are some of the things they say lead this way, some of the way they lead that way, and here you are, this is what I think, this is what he thinks, this is what they think, and the person with Yeshuv Hadat can hear all these conflicting bits and can find a place to stand in the middle of it all and have what I would call a sane, deliberate view of the whole thing, in which he's not pulled unduly in one side or the other. It has to do with a certain balance, with a certain integration. And the stirot, as you say, somewhere it's making sense of all the conflicting issues, finding a place to stand in which you can do justice in some way to the whole picture. That's Yeshuv Hadat. And that's what Yaakov experiences now, that he thinks that history is over. I have arrived at the perfect interpretation of the texts, which gives me a sense now of that kind of lucidity. I now master the threatening text, the text that really came to threaten my future. I've done all that. And he's very happy. It doesn't matter. He spent 20-odd years suffering. He doesn't seem to deal with one little item there that he doesn't seem to deal with very much in his interpretation, and that is there was a time frame mentioned, yes, 400 years for the exile, and he doesn't actually deal with that problem. He says, I've been 20 years in the house of Lavan, and I did it in a speeded up, fast forward. I did it all very quickly, and we are now Yotze. Now that's Yeshuv Hadat for him. There's a certain, I would really translate right down there, I would translate Yeshuv Hadat sanity. It's a kind of sane, unexcited, unseduced way of looking at the data, at what there is. And as soon as that happens, God then said, and here you have immediately the swing over to the other side. God then said, my thought is deeper than yours. Deeper. And that's the kind of thing you don't want to know when you've arrived at Yeshuv Hadat. When you've arrived at what you think is the perfect balance, you really are not so keen to hear that God's thoughts are deeper than yours. And in order to back it up, the Midrash quotes from Yeshayahu, Lo machshavotai machshavotechem. My thoughts are not your thoughts. So you can see how the Midrash works. It works in a way, nothing is said completely out of the blue, but there's interpretation at every step. My thoughts are not your thoughts become my thoughts are deeper than your thoughts. That I have depth to my thoughts. You have a very pleasant surface to your thoughts, but there are vertiginous depths to my thoughts. And what happens immediately after that? Immediately God brought upon him the Alilah al-Yidei Yosef, the terrible plot through Yosef. Now, plot, Alilah, are you saying something?
Isn't that like a mensch tracht and God lacht?
Yeah, it is something like that. But it's no laughing matter. I mean, if we say it and laugh, it's about trivial things. A mensch tracht and God lacht. Yes, do you know? Have you heard that Yiddish? A person makes plans and God laughs. Yeah. But that's if it's about something serious, then it's no laughing matter. And here we're trying to get hold of the more serious edge of this. That God seems in some way to want to educate people away from a certain kind of sense-making. Everything fits. I'll put it, that's a very simple heading for what I'm talking about. That very satisfying feeling that everything fits. And God says, my thoughts are deeper. Where I live, not everything fits. It isn't exactly like that. And so immediately he brought upon him this Alilah, the plot line of the story of Yosef. Causes, effects, consequences, that whole chain of events that brought them down to Egypt in the end. And of course the word plot is not just a neutral plot line, it also has a malevolent meaning, the plot against someone. Nora alila al bnei adam. Terrible are your plots against human beings. It's from, where's it from? Mishle? Tehillim? Terrible are your plots against human beings, and the Midrash says about that when you have a plot against someone, when you have a unhappy story for them, you bring it upon them through an alilah. That is, you bring it upon them through their own acts. That means, so it doesn't emerge as deus ex machina, I came down and I made something terrible happen. It seems to come about through natural causes that come from your psychology, from your family life. It seems to arise naturally, and there's something terrible about that. But we're talking here about a plot, and then Midrash finishes with rubbing it in a way, and saying, so when exactly did God bring this plot upon Yaakov, upon Yosef? At the very moment, Shenityaesh Mishiabud Mitzrayim. At the moment that Nityaesh is despaired, and this is unexpected. He despaired of the exodus, of the slavery in Egypt, or the persecution usually you despair of something good. You hope for something good, and then the opposite voice comes, and you despair. But in rabbinic Hebrew, you very often find, in halachic contexts, that Nityaesh simply means to give up on an idea of some kind, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. So here, the tragic prospect of the Egyptian slavery, Yaakov in some way loses energy to believe in it. He gave up on it, even though God had said it very seriously, and he finds a way of getting out of it, because he hasn't got the energy to take on that future. Something is off with Yaakov here, Nityaesh. At the moment he gave up on the Egyptian slavery, of course he feels very differently about what he did. V'nityashva da'ato, his mind became settled, that is. At that very moment, God brought that plot upon him, Shenemar vayeshev Yaakov. So do you see how, it's a very clever midrash. What is Yaakov settled down? It's that tragic opting for an intellectually satisfying theory that will let you off the rigors of life, of God's words. You have found, it seems, a very satisfactory way of exorcising the sinister edge of things, And then at that very moment, something happens to make you aware that there's something wrong with that move. That Yishuv Hadat, although it's undoubtedly a virtue, and that's again what I find it's very interesting. It's undoubtedly a virtue when you're studying texts, when you want to be a chacham, and you want to help people, and so on. Deliberateness, composure, well-balanced. It's possible to get that wrong. It's possible to go overboard with that, and it becomes a kind of defensive move, and then somewhere one is set back on one's heels. Now, we're still very abstract. The wild animal that leaps. Is there a wild animal in the story? What leaps on Yaakov? What leaps? What wild animal leaps? Any reference to it? Okay, I'm sticking closer to the text at first. Let me ask it like this. I missed a step. What's the opposite of Yishuv Hadat? Thank you. Teruf Hadat. Right? It's certainly one of the possible opposites. The opposite of sanity is insanity. The torn mind is the opposite of the settled mind. You got it all together, it all falls apart. That's what I'm calling insanity. Teruf Hadat, the torn mind. And if already we're saying teruf, watch how I'm working here. If we're saying teruf, then where does the word turn up in the text? Where is there evidence of a torn mind? Tarof, Toraf, Yosef. Yeah. The diagnosis of what has happened to Yosef, he has indeed been torn apart. A wild beast has consumed him. Who says that? Yaakov. Yaakov. Yeah, there were a few theories here. It's not the brothers. The brothers just show him the data. They show him the torn, bloody coat, which they have doctored very carefully with goat's blood, which is like human blood, says Rashi. So it's a very deliberate decoy. It's a very deliberate deception. And of course, he says, right, the circumstantial evidence is very strong. And so he's the one who diagnoses the whole situation. And he says, Yosef has been torn apart. A wild beast has massacred him. Is that true? It's not true. That is, there's no wild animal in the story, actually. Where is the wild animal, if not in Yaakov's mind? That in some way, what Yaakov is doing here, let me just put it on the table and make my suggestion, that Yaakov is expressing his deepest fear, the thing he was always afraid of. He was afraid of wild animals, and therefore the frenzied search for peace. The idea that that's what he wants most in his life, to settle down in Shalva. Things have to hang together because they don't hang together. Yeah. And where that comes from, one can only speculate. I'm not so much interested in what causes it. I just want to follow the phenomenon. But you could think about Esav, who is a hunter. You could think about the relationship with Esav, about Yaakov being an Ishtam. He's first described as a simple, straightforward man who lives in tents. He's just an introvert who begins to realize very quickly that his tmimut is more complicated than he thought. So his story gets troubled very quickly as soon as he deceives his father. His own sense of himself begins to get troubled. And some of us who've been together for this will remember the history of how we talked about this in the past. What we have here then is a man who is troubled by wild beasts in his fantasy. And where again does he refer to wild beasts? He chooses a profession. Now, this is very interesting. People choose a profession. I won't say people. Yaakov chooses a profession which is an admired profession in biblical narrative. All the greats have this profession. Moshe and David, what's the profession? He's a shepherd. He's a shepherd who's there to watch the sheep, to guard the sheep. From what? From wild animals. That's what it means. And he himself uses the expression, right? Do you remember in last week's parsha when he he makes his declaration to his employer, to Lavan, and he says, Trefa lo heveti elecha. I never brought you a treif animal. I never brought you a torn animal. That is, I was such a vigilant shepherd for your sheep that no wild animal ever got to your flock. And that he's very proud of that. Trefa lo heveti elecha. Trefa is everything Yaakov doesn't want. It's madness, it's discomposure, it's out of balance, things out of balance. And so the great emphasis on bikesh leshev b'shalva. And here what we have then is an idea that comes out of his mind. All right, he had circumstantial evidence in the coat, but that doesn't entirely mean that Yaakov didn't have any of his own fantasy. All right, where did that expression come from? Tarof toraf, chayara achalat. There is something in the person who said it. Somewhere this is an ongoing, it's some kind of I wouldn't say an obsession, but it's a deep concern in Yaakov's mind. Have a look now at the next two Midrashim. We'll just touch on them. I'm just so impressed. I'm so amazed at what these Midrashim come to touch. Let's start with number 4 instead of 3. We'll go back to 3. 4. This is Yaakov talking to Lavan about his impeccable work record. Esrim Shana, I've been working for you for 20 years. Sleep never left my eyes. Sleep never visited my eyes. So I was completely open-eyed and vigilant, lucid at all times. Trefa lo heveti elecha. I never brought you a torn animal. And what follows in the Torah is Anochi achatena. If ever there were any losses, I would make it good from my own personal pocket. And the expression is, I would sin. But lachto can actually mean, metaphorically, it means if there is a problem, I would. What's the word I want? I would compensate. I would fill up what's missing.
To clean up.
To clean up, thank you. Yes. Which comes from the sense of sin, but it's the opposite. It's dealing with a problem. Good, thank you. So what do we have here then? It's a most extraordinary statement here. Here, the Midrash takes seriously, I was sinning. Instead of translating it, I would make good on any losses, translates it, I was sinning. All along when I was protecting the tame things, I was sinning against the wild things. Because every lion is promised its teref. Every animal should have its daily food. That's the teref, tearing the torn food of the torn animal, is the daily food of animals, including us. Natan teref li re'av. God gives those who fear him their daily food. That's teref. Do you remember that pasuk? Le? Yes, thank you. There you have it again. But Noten teref li re'av has a wonderful and terrible Hassidic reading, which exactly fits our subject, which is that God gives madness to those who fear him. Now, this is not for the children. It's not. I wouldn't pass this on through the generations. You sort of keep it to yourself if it says anything to you. That is that those who are his yireim, those who fear him, suffer terrific conflicts. They suffer somewhere the experience of not being able to control the data, of not being able to explain everything away. And that's, we're jumping the gun a little here. And here what you have is Yaakov suddenly becoming aware that in being so protective of the tame things, he has actually done an injustice to the wild things. It's an ecological violation that he's interrupted the food chain. He's disturbed the food chain. So now the wild things, and he suddenly feels guilty and he calls it a sin. In other words, it's a paradox. How can you protect the tame things and at the same time not deprive the wild things? Well, maybe you can just talk in terms of measure, but there seems to be something else at work here. Something defensive. There's such a thing as a position where a virtue becomes not a virtue when it becomes too frenzied. That in some way one's using it in order to reassure oneself, now something like that here. So he feels now suddenly that there was something wrong in his balance of things. You know Maurice Sendak's children's story, of course, where the wild things are. Yes? No? Yes? Yeah. About the terrible, really fearsome wild things, gnashing their terrible teeth and rolling their terrible eyes and so on. Very frightening pictures, illustrations. And of course, little Max at 8 years old is the king of all of them. You know, he has a reign of peace. You know, he controls all that madness until he goes back home and is happy to see his supper warm waiting for him. Let's have a look now at number 3. A wild beast has consumed him. And this is Midrashic and Hassidic. Again, it's not so easily to be found. Quotation from Isaiah. God reproaches the people. Why should you say, Jacob, and why should you speak this, Israel? What are you saying? Nistara darki me Hashem. Why should you say, my way is hidden from God? And this is addressing the people Israel, the people of Israel in Isaiah. Now, the people of Israel are doubting hashgacha, they're doubting providence, they're doubting meaning. God's not watching me. God doesn't see me. My way is hidden from God. You shouldn't say such things. Why do you say it? And then the Midrash makes this unexpected move. I mean, it's completely unpredictable. And applies it now to Yaakov the man. As it were, the Midrash addresses Yaakov and says, why are you saying my way is hidden from God? When was he saying that? He didn't say that. That's in the book of Isaiah. You know, suddenly you take that expression and you put it into Yaakov's mouth. And you say, if you have the kind of imagination that the sages have, you say he must have been thinking something like this. My way is hidden from God. Why? And here's the explanation that's offered here. Why must he be saying this, hypothetically? All those years I've been guarding Lavan's sheep so that no wild animal ever got at them. And now they set on my beloved son. It doesn't make any sense in terms of the logic of my life, of the imagery of my life, that my whole life was set against wildness, and now this wildness comes and tears me apart, tears my and you can almost hear his mind falling apart as he says that. Now that's not intellectual, you know, that is a very deeply felt sense, not just I've lost my beloved son, that's plenty. It's also, it doesn't make any sense in terms of justice in the largest sense, of things that feel in some way right. You sinned in a certain direction, so you get punished. Here it's just the opposite. I had a virtue of keeping the wild things at bay. And this happens to my son? And somewhere there's that sense of complete, what's the word, anomie? There's no law, there's no explanation. Where's the law? Again, in the largest sense. And this is part of Chazal's thought about Yaakov. You know, the Chazal are very free here in this, almost like with Eov. You know, they're very free with what we normally associate with Greek tragedy. Certain themes that you find in Greek tragedy, and that people say sometimes, oh, you don't find that in Judaism. You know, we say it rather complacently. That tragedy is not a Jewish thing. You know, that we don't have a tragic view of the world. Someone very, very capable, much more capable than I am, who I will not name, says that in public. And I deeply disagree. I think the sages certainly, to go back no further, are very aware of what we call a tragic dimension to life, which means there's no obvious happy ending. Things just fall apart. Where is hope in all this? Is there room for hope in this? It's going to have a very special place now. It's not just going to be the obvious happy ending of one kind or another. And with this, I want to move straight on from Yaakov's tornness. You could say, incidentally, you might say that Yaakov, he's not saying the literal truth. There is no wild animal. It came out of his mind. Or you could say that there is a wild animal somewhere on the loose here. Maybe the brothers are the wild animal. The brothers, after all. Thomas Mann certainly thinks so in his book when he describes the scene by the pit and how the brothers drag his clothes off him and tear his clothes And they say they're really tearing him apart. And that's what Yaakov intuits. He's a sense. There is terrible hatred in this family somewhere. There's a wild animal on the loose. Now, is he telling the truth? Is he not? What is he actually saying? Or is he talking about himself, his most private concerns? I want to move now to the dream that Yosef insists on telling his brothers. There are two dreams, you remember? The one about the sheaves of wheat, and the other one is about sun and moon and 11 stars that bow down to him. The second dream he tells his brothers, in fact he appeals to his brothers to listen to him. Shim'una, please listen to me while I tell you this dream that I have dreamed. Now, is Yosef completely, who was it who was called the wisest fool in Christendom? King James VI of Scotland and the first of England. That is, he comes across as a nar. He says he was nar, that he is in the Yiddish sense a fool, along with being very wise. His father chose him as his selected son, his beloved son, Ben Zekunav, because of his wisdom, because he's somewhere an heir. He's an heir of Yaakov's own sense of himself. But he inherits some of that judiciousness, knowledge. But when it comes to what you call emotional intelligence, well, he's a 17-year-old boy. And that's really what Rashi says in that first passage that I didn't look at. How does the whole story get started? It's because Yosef was 17 years old. And a 17-year-old boy who is very talented, who is favored by his father, who is disliked by his brothers, who is the son of the favorite wife, is going to be in a very difficult situation. And in some way, knowing that they dislike him, he nevertheless pleads with them, look, I've had this dream. I don't know what to do with it. I have to tell it to someone. Please listen to me. And he's really appealing for a great deal here. He wants them somewhere to enter into his perplexity, into his sense of what can he do with himself in his situation. But in a very obvious way, he's infuriating them. He doesn't have the experience, he doesn't have that kind of awareness to know that he's infuriating them. He's just making them listen to his dream of grandeur, to his dream of power. And then he insists on telling it to his father as well, in his brother's presence. So they get to hear it twice. Once isn't enough. And so he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him, and he said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall we really come, I and your mother and your brothers, to bow down to you to the earth? What an unlikely dream. That's really an absurd dream you've been having. Where on earth did you get that from? If you look at Rashi takes, I think, the plausible line of saying that he rebukes him because he realizes that he's drawing hatred on himself. And also, he pretends to disparage the dream in order to draw away the hatred of the brothers. Right? In order, the brothers shouldn't take the dream seriously. So the father does take the dream seriously. It says, Va'aviv shamar et hadavar, that there's something that he puts away. He writes it in his diary, the Midrash says. He actually, with the date and the place, that there was this dream. So he does think it's a serious dream, but he makes fun of it for performative purposes in order to get the brothers off him. But look then at what Rashi says. Look at the Havo Navo, the last part of number 6. But your mother is already dead. What makes the dream so absurd? There's the detail about the moon. There's the sun and the moon and the 11 stars. Well, that's perfectly transparent. As soon as you have 11 stars, you know it's the 11 brothers, and the sun is the father, and the moon is the mother, and here Yaakov is interpreting the dream in the most plausible, obvious way. It's the father, mother, 11 brothers. But it's Yaakov's words. Yaakov puts words to it. And he says, they all come and bow down to me. That's what's in the dream. Bow down to Yosef. Don't you realize how absurd that is? Your mother's dead. How can she bow down to you? There's an obvious absurdity in the dream, so we can just forget about the dream. That's Yaakov's performance. And the Midrash then adds, but it's not really absurd. Don't worry, dear reader, fear not. The dream is not a totally absurd dream, because actually the mother here refers not to Rachel, who's dead, but to Bilhah, who brought him up. after Rachel died. So you have here a kind of manipulating of the facts to say, well, she was his foster mother, so it refers to her. Whew. So it's not actually an absurd dream. We've got rid of the absurdity. And then Rashi goes on to quote something much more dynamite, much more interesting, which has become a kind of proverb or aphorism in Jewish lore, I think. Ein chalom belo dvarim betelim. There is no dream without empty things in it. There's no dream that doesn't have some elements in it that are meaningless. Forget about Bilhah. It refers to Rachel. And it doesn't make sense. And nevertheless, that's what he dreamed, and the dream on the whole is serious. And the nature of dreams is that they will always have a spot, something in them that doesn't make sense. And something similar is true, I want to say, thinking forward, about the dream of life. That it's to be taken seriously, it's to be interpreted, it's to be taken personally, and so on. But don't drive for total meaning. That there are always things, you have to have a certain kind of judiciousness, a certain way of backing off from the search for total meaningfulness. But here we're talking about dreams, and dreams are dubious. Anyway, what do you think about dreams? So here what the sages are saying is something I want to suggest that finds a much more public airing in Sigmund Freud, who regarded himself as the heir of Yosef, that he was the dream man. He is the dream interpreter, and he looks to Yosef as his precursor, the poter chalamot, the one who decodes dreams, who interprets dreams, who makes sense of dreams. And that's what he regarded his function as being as a psychoanalyst. He is developing that ability in himself. And he has a famous expression in his discussion it's a famous discussion which I want to go into now for a little while, of a dream of his own. He self-analyzes his own dream, and he arrives at momentous conclusions that really found the whole art of psychoanalysis. This expression he comes up with is that when you're looking at a dream, there's always, in every dream, there is a navel, N-A-V-E-L, a belly button. What's it called in Yiddish? Pupik, thank you. It must be late at night. These slightly comic, endearing terms. There's a belly button in the dream. There's a navel that's a bit more elegant. There's a navel of the dream which is just too complicated. It's made up of threads coming from all kinds. It's a knot of some kind. And don't even try to interpret that. It goes down into, it connects with the unknown. It's the place where the dream connects with the unknown and the uninterpretable. What the unconscious, that is, it's the place where you really can't do very much in terms of of interpretation. So leave that part alone, what he calls the navel of the dream. Now it seems to me that's very similar to what the rabbis said, that there's no dream that doesn't have empty, a place that is like a hole in the dream, but you just can't do anything with it. It can either be empty or it can be too full. It's too complicated. It's just something you can't handle. You can't deal with it. And it seems to me that Freud must have known that almost folk wisdom in Jewish society, but of course I can't prove it. But what I do want to do now is to go into that particular dream, because I think it can lead us back to Yaakov and Yosef, a little better freighted, a bit with more equipment. The story goes like this. Freud had a patient called Irma who complained of terrible pain in her throat, that she has a knot in her throat. She's strangled, she can't talk, and pain in her abdomen, those two places in the body. And he works with her, and he suggests a solution. That is an interpretation, some interpretation of her symptoms, and she rejects his suggestion. She won't accept his solution. And so he's a little bit annoyed with her, probably, because she leaves him after that. And then one day he meets a colleague, a doctor, And the doctor says, I met Irma today, and she is really not well. In other words, you didn't succeed in curing her. And he feels bad. And before he goes to sleep at night, he conscientiously sits down and writes out a lucid history, case history of Irma, just to remind himself of the whole story. And then he goes to sleep and he has a dream. And in his dream, Irma turns up at an open house that he and his wife are entertaining. And Irma comes among the other people. And she comes to Freud and she says to him, I feel terrible. I'm suffering. And he asks her to open her mouth so that he can examine her to see what's going on down there in her throat. And other doctors gather around, and all these men are standing around, peering down into her throat. She is a little embarrassed. She feels awkward, and he thinks a little patronizingly, oh, women are so vain. Women are, after all, we're all doctors. Why should she be thinking about man, woman? We're doctor and patient. He also thinks at the same moment that it's just too bad that we can't examine women patients without their clothes. In that time, you examined women patients through their clothes. And all this is a bar to science. It's a bar to clear analytic understanding. And so he thinks somewhere all this nonsense of man, woman, and so on. And then they detect a nasty-looking blotch in her throat, an infection of some kind, and something in her shoulder, they see also is infected. And then one of Freud's colleagues says, it's my fault, I think. I gave her an injection yesterday, and the syringe was not properly cleaned. Chate. It wasn't properly sanitized. What's the word I want? Sterilized. Wasn't properly. And Freud wakes up. And he immediately thinks, and he writes it down, now I understand what dreams are for. Dreams are for wish fulfillment. What has this dream done for me? So he's ironic about himself. He says, what it's done for me is let me off the hook in my responsibility for the patient. It turns out it's my colleague who's responsible. It was his fault. And so I can feel better. And that's the meaning in general of dreams. That dreams are there to serve your less savory personal interests, the wishes that are not so publishable, that you don't want to take responsibility for something or whatever. So you have to give him credit for being actually very honest. He's really looking at it, not that whatever I do is fine. That actually my dream testifies against me. And that's the nature of dreams. It tells you something about yourself, about what your wish is. And he asks a question in the course of his discussion of this dream. He asks a question, classic question, what does a woman want? What does a woman want? I think he gets credit for actually asking the question. Because in general, men have always known what women wanted. Always already known. Everyone knows that a woman wants to get married, wants to have children, and that's about it. That's what a woman wants. And Freud, way before women were really expressing themselves very fully about what they wanted, right? It's still before, there were a few exceptional women, but not many. He already understands that there's a mystery here, that there's something about woman that's different from a man. And what I think she wants may not be the whole truth. Somewhere I have to allow for a certain distortion that's created by the fact that I'm totally different from her. Different in sex. My sexuality is different from hers. Right? We're all human beings, of course. And therefore, for instance, I shouldn't be so surprised that she resisted my interpretation. Her resistance, her refusal to let me help her, isn't that what it amounts to? Yeah? Freud had first thought of in the way a doctor would think of a patient who refuses the medication. Here, I gave her this prescription, and she is so, she's so stupid, she's so irrational that she doesn't want to accept something that might help her. And he begins to realize through the dynamics of the dream, and I can't talk about all the dynamics, it's just too much. He begins to realize through the dynamics of the dream that a new kind of listening has to be tried. I am not a doctor with a patient. Right? It's giving up on a treasured, on a treasured image for the psychoanalyst. When they wanted to be taken seriously, they wanted to say, and you had to have a medical degree, actually, in order to treat people psychoanalytically. That's an old issue. Actually, that's not the nature of the relationship. The nature of the relationship is not master-slave. It's not subject-object. I am the subject who knows, and she is the material that's being presented to me, the symptoms and so on. I look at the data, and I interpret the data, and I give her the remedy for it. It can't be like that. If it's like that, you can't be surprised that she resists it. Right? Because resistance is the obvious reaction of, even in physical medicine. You know the statistics, I don't remember the statistics, of patients who don't take the pills that they're prescribed. Either they refuse to take them or they just forget to take them. So even in physical medicine, Kal vachomer, when it comes to things of the inner world, of course she resists. The resistance is the most plausible thing about, and it's the most interesting thing about her. That's what leads me beyond my knowledge. That's what leads me into an area of the unknown. And recognizing that I'm dealing now with something that doesn't fit. It doesn't fit my own scheme of things. And in a way, taking it further, I'm using the interpretation here of, it's a super interpretation of Shoshana Fellman, who is a contemporary analyst and scholar, literary scholar. And she says it's not only that a man is different from a woman, but also that each person is different from him or herself. That is, I contain in myself a difference. There are the things I can say and there are the things I can't say. Because they're too deep, because they're too complex, I can't get at them. The unconscious, let's say. The knot in the throat, the strangling in the throat, is the most interesting thing about her. Again, it frustrates him because she can't say it plain. She can't talk plainly. He can't have a discussion with her. He feels very annoyed about that she doesn't yield to sane discussion. Because there she is, and he says, actually, the most important thing about her is the fact that she can't speak. That actually, when she tries to speak, if I were to listen to how she can't speak, I would know more about her than with all the sane, coherent accounts that she can give me of her life. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? We're dealing here with things that resist being put into sane language, into rational language. And if I'm to help her, I have to join her in that territory. And that means also partly recognizing that I'm not just a doctor with a patient, but I am a patient as well. That I have my own unconscious, I have my own sexuality, which is a mystery to me, which I don't entirely understand. And somewhere there is that sense that I can't make entire sense and make everything fit into an extroverted account, into an explicit account of my life. He emphasizes her throat a great deal. It's the throat and the abdomen. She can't give birth. Right? In some way, there's something clogged up down there and up here. What is the throat? And here again, I don't know if he knew this or not, but in the Zohar, there is this expression, metzarei hagaron, the narrow places of the throat, which is almost like tsa'ar, the troubles of the throat, the chokedness of the throat, the way the throat gets choked up. And that comes to express, it's a kind of allegorical understanding of Mitzrayim, Mitzarim. What is it to be involved in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, in the Egyptian slavery? It's an internal psychic condition in which one's throat is closed up. One can't take things from one's body and move them through language up to one's head. The throat is what joins the head and the body. That's in Kabbalistic thinking. That narrowness of this place here, the channels here are so narrow, they can get choked up. And then you have to find a mode of geula, somehow to set them free. And it won't be, all the rational analysis in the world is not going to help you in this. You have to be able to get somewhere beyond that, to the place of the wild things, to find some way of recognizing at least the existence of things that can't be put into words. Rabbi Nachman, who you may be familiar with, talks actually about Metzarei Hagaron and uses the Yiddish word Hazerik. That people, when they consult the Rebbe, often they suddenly have an attack of coughing or hoarseness. Haserich means hoarseness. Yeah, hoarseness. And of course, in psychoanalysis, it's a joke that often the patient has to clear his throat. He's constantly clearing his throat when he gets emotional or whatever. There's some kind of haze begins to happen in there. So here is the patient who is an example now. She's a paradigm to Freud of how he has to get beyond his sanity. He has to get beyond that, the poverty of his complete interpretations, and understand that there's a place here that's very difficult to get to. In fact, one may not be able to get to at all. And that changes your whole relationship. What then should be the relationship to the patient? How should, Shoshana Feldman asks, I can't just resist adding this, how, she asks, and she notes that feminists have, for feminists, Freud is a pet hatred. You know, that there's a whole line in feminist psychological thinking that dislikes Freud intensely, that he is very imperious, you know, and he treats women as material and so on and so on. And Shoshana Feldman says, yes, but that's just ignoring the genius who is a male, is throwing out the baby with the bathwater. How does one relate to a male genius if one is a woman? That's a very interesting question. Right? After all, he's a genius. You want to take advantage of his insight. But inside every insight, there is a blind spot. That's what she comes up with. That it goes together. It's the other side of the insight. And I haven't got a very good example at hand, but it seems to me it's very true. That your strengths are also your limitations. What you see very clearly and helpfully, it contains in itself something you don't see. And that's why it's good to talk to other people. You know, that somewhere, you know, your genius can meet some other genius and fight to the death. Something like that. We're not talking in the world of sanity at this point. Sanity and insight. Okay. So what is the navel of Yosef's dream? Going back to Yosef. Rachel, his mother. His mother is dead. And yet he dreams, under the guise of the moon. It's the moon, but it's very transparent. It's an easy interpretation. He simply reports in a very triumphant way, this is what I dreamed, that my father and mother and 11 brothers are going to bow down to me. What is the impossible place in the dream? That's my mother who is dead, giving birth to my brother. I didn't have a mother to bring me up. I barely remember her. And here I'm so easily and professionally interpreting the dream. No, she's going to come and bow down to me. That is, with all the lucidity of the interpretation, right? The moon is the mother and the sun is the father and so on. There is a certain obtuseness to the mystery in things. That actually he's talking about fraught material that he must have very deep feelings about. They're talking about his dead mother. And somehow he's managed to disappear her. He's managed to exile what is strange from his dream, what is uncanny, he's managed to put away out of sight. And he's left only with that which is manageable. Now, what does that tell us then about Yosef and about Yaakov? Because I want to say that Yosef is Yaakov in this. That Yosef gets this from Yaakov. I'll start with Yosef because I really have just one thing to say about Yosef. And that is, if he is a decoder of dreams, poter chalamot, you notice how it works. It means that he is like one of these analysts who are hired by corporations at enormous fees to come in and analyze the data, right, and join the dots. These are the significant, this is the line, this is the alila, this is the plot line that you should follow, and do your best to deal with this now. Watch out for that story that I'm bringing out of all the data. That's what Yosef does. He decodes the dream. He solves the dream. Poter, pitaron. It's a word that's invented for Yosef. It was never used before, and it will never be used again, till we get to the final dream interpreter at the end in the book of Daniel, at the end of Tanakh. And there it's used again. But it's used many times of Yosef. What is his professional expertise? Like his father, whose professional expertise expressed his shepherding, expressed something very deep inside him. Yosef's professional expertise is to decode complicated material, not necessarily, right, to listen to it as if he's just viewing the data, rather than really listening. He doesn't really listen because that would create the possibility of chaos. He might not get a clear storyline if he really listened. He would be distracted, you might say. And in a way, the whole of psychoanalysis is about distraction. It's about free association, saying all kinds of wild things that come into your head, putting down the barriers against destruction, pulling them down, and saying, yes, I'm going to say anything and everything. And it's not going to be so obvious what the thread is. Now, the analyst, of course, is listening a little differently, but still, he's with the patient. He's following through. And here, Yosef has a certain, in that sense, he explains the dreams very satisfactorily for practical purposes. Pharaoh knows now there's going to be seven fertile years and 7 years of famine, and it's all the fat cows and then the thin cows. And it's a very clear, practical interpretation that tells Pharaoh what to do about it in order to save his country, and incidentally also to give a very important job to Yosef. Because part of Yosef's interpretation is you should appoint an ish navon v'chacham. You should appoint an intelligent person to run the country under you, by which he clearly means himself, and immediately Pharaoh swallows the bait. And he says, there's no one as intelligent as you. I hereby appoint you. So you notice that it's a teleological interpretation. It's an interpretation that aims at its ending. It wants a happy ending. It wants an ending that is practical and that serves me and serves my people and my family. That's the kind of, it's a decoding of a puzzle. An interpretation could be more than that. An interpretation, a real listening interpretation might be more than that. It might take account of the dead mother, for instance, of disturbing things in the data that don't fit any clear storyline, and go with those. Somewhere listen deeply to those. In order to illustrate this point, I don't know how far you're with me on this. I wanted to quote from William Empson. Let's see how this goes down. He was a poet and an essayist, British. And someone gives him an essay to read and comment on. I think your analysis is right as far as it goes, he says. This is a very intellectual comment. I think your analysis is right as far as it goes. But if completed, it leaves no word which is at all meaningless. Now, it cuts right, it's madness suddenly. Suddenly that last word introduces madness into his answer. You expect him to say the opposite. That's the usual critique that people make. You don't come to a clear, cogent argument. You need to connect things better. And he says the opposite. He says you've connected things so beautifully that you haven't left a single loose thread trailing. And I don't know what to do with it now. It's useless to me because it gives me nothing to think about. You have a perfect case you've built here. And other than incriminating the criminal, what else is it supposed to do for me? If there's a loose thread, I can think about that. I can try to work on it myself. That is, it's one thing that I wanted to put on the table. And another British comment, British wit, British impatience. This is Wilfred Bion, who was one of the great earlier psychoanalysts. And he says this. He's explaining something to a friend, to a student, something complicated. And the other person then says, I understand, which can be annoying often, when someone says, I understand. And so he answers them and he says, please try not to understand. You can superstand, you can circumstand, you can stand around it, don't stand under it. In other words, I don't want your total competence. Your total perfect version of what I've said, it's all wrong. Now, in other words, Winnicott, another of that generation of psychoanalysts, says we are poor indeed if we are only sane. We are poor indeed if we are only sane. And so I come back to Yaakov. And as usual, I'm trying to do things quickly. Let's have a look. תכלית ידיעה, yeah. But in a very specific sense here. Yeah. It's keeping contact with the mystery. Keeping that as part of the vista, that there's something I don't know. There's something in a way that I can't know. It's not just for humility. It's not just to be a more moral person. It's really something larger than that. It has an ethical implication. Have a look, for instance, and I think I'm going to go straight to this now, to the Mea Shiloach in number 9. Here's the Ishbitzer being very Ishbitz. This is one of the... Here Yaakov comes to understand suddenly something about his own blind spot. And how does he do it? It's an imaginative stroke. I mean, the Ishbitzer could have been a novelist if he weren't many other things as well. He does it, Yaakov comes to this understanding by looking at his grandson, Yehuda's son, Er. So you have the grandfather contemplating the grandson and saying suddenly, you mirror something in me. And what is it? It's a strange story. It's an uncanny story. Yehuda had 2 sons, Er and Onan. And they both died rather weirdly after they married Tamar, one after the other. And the text of the Torah says about Onan that he died because, doesn't need decoding, it's there in the Torah, because he spilled his seed on the ground. And the assumption is that Er died of the same thing, the rabbinic assumption, the Midrashic assumption that he died of the same thing, although it doesn't say it. And there you have the Midrash that explains. That's the next level. The Midrash explains why was he punished for doing that? Or I'll put the question differently. What was wrong with doing that? And the idea that is given there is that he tried to prevent her becoming pregnant so that it wouldn't spoil her beauty. Isn't that interesting? It's a question of preserving beauty, that Er wanted to keep the pristine beauty, which will never be the same again once she's become pregnant. And he is so fixed on the preservation of beauty that he blocks newness. He blocks birth. He blocks procreation. And Yaakov suddenly realizes that in a very rarefied way, not in terms of physical acts, there's a similar problem with his worship of God, as he puts it, with his worship life, with his spiritual life. That he's always so concerned not to spoil the beauty of his world, that he holds back from actions that demand some wildness, let's say, something that's not so cautious, in order to allow, not to be so concerned with the issue of beauty. And what started off as a very rarefied thing with Yaakov, what happens sometimes, he says, Kabbalistically speaking, is that becomes a whole human being afterwards. A whole human being then is obsessed with the question of beauty and doesn't want to give birth because of that. But what interests me is this. First of all, there's this fascinating idea that one can begin to understand oneself by looking at what came out of the loins of what came out of the loins of oneself, as he puts it. In other words, it's the sexual life, it's the biological life. You just look at what develops. It's the greatest mystery of all. And you look at what develops 2 generations later, and you see something in yourself magnified so that you can't avoid it. And suddenly you understand something. Beyond that, the Mea Shiloach goes on to say this. What are you sacrificing if you're over intent on beauty, on wholeness, on rightness, on things fitting, on things being symmetrical, on things being well integrated, as it were? What are you giving up? And he says what you're giving up is holada. You are giving up, you are blocking procreation. Not just physically. But he goes to physical images. He says, for instance, and here it's a little wry moment, he says everyone knows that the actual moment of impregnation, the moment of the meeting of the male and the female, is not a moment of totally clear intellect. It's not a moment in which, here I am, taking a measure of my life and to shave b'shalva, to sit here peacefully and decide what should be in my life and what should not be in my life. It's a moment of unconsciousness. Hester, he calls it hester. He uses other words, header, absence, that you're actually absent at that moment. Your ego is absent. Something else takes over, a wildness takes over, and that's only under that condition that there can be holada. So madness has to have its moment. Otherwise, there can be no holada. And he goes on then to talk very, very simple analogy to the seed in the ground. You take a beautiful, nice, clean seed, and you put it in the ground where it gets all dirty and corrupted and rotten, and rots in the ground, and up comes the new shoot from there. Now, the emphasis is not on dirt here. That's not an association that we want. But it's the idea here of breaking up, of units breaking up. And that is Yaakov's issue, he wants to say. It's too great a love for things holding together, for Yeshuv Hadad, the idea of sanity that we've been talking about. Yaakov recognizes this in himself, and he recognizes it in relation to Rachel. Last week we talked a little bit about how he can't acknowledge her tragic sense of things, that she recognizes that there's a split in things, that this world is not capable of having everything come in nice, satisfactory unities. That in this world there's a Rachel and there's a Leah, and they have to live side by side somewhere, and they are mutually exclusive. That's how it feels at any rate. It's completely wrong that Leah is there. And yet Rachel tolerates it, that Rachel finds a way of living well with it. And Yaakov can't understand this in his own wife Rachel. And again, I'll refer to the most extraordinary scene, which we talked about last week, that Rachel comes crying to him, saying, "Give me children, or else, or if nothing, I'm dead. Im ayin meta anochi." If there is a nothing in me, if there's an emptiness in me, that's the navel of the dream, right? If there is this uncanny sense, in spite of all my best attempts, to feel alive and to feel nevertheless I'm dead. And she comes to him and describes an unimaginable situation, perhaps, for a man. Although, again, I'm not sure. Maybe on a human level he could find, if he tried, he could find an analogy in his own experience, but he doesn't even try. He simply fends her off with her threatening irrationality. I talked to my husband about this evening, and bless him, he said, "Well, wasn't that rather irrational of her? Walking straight into my trap." But yes, of course. And he replies rationally, "Am I in place of God? Why are you turning to me for help?" It's very, and he's angry with her. He's angry. And I'm reading this, as you can see how I'm reading this. What is his anger? What is his protest? He can't stand that she in some way lives with that complex sense of life that he doesn't want, that he is allergic to, in fact. He changes the name of the child. The child that is born as she dies, she names for the doubleness of the experience, that is death and life. And the father changes the name immediately to Binyamin, strength, something well coordinated, something that fits together very well. There comes a moment at the end of the story, however, and I want to think that Yaakov, in some way, something gets through to him. At the end of the whole story, he talks to Yosef, and he says to him, when I was coming back from Padan Aram, on my journey back from Lavan, Meta alai Rachel. Rachel died upon me. What's that alai? Very unusual. You can say li, as the sages say. That's a wife dies for her husband. But it's not, alai is not exactly that. So I'm cutting through complexity here, and I'm coming through. It could mean, it seems to me, that Yaakov, for the first time, takes upon himself alai, that he feels the weight of Rachel in all her largeness, in the capacity that she had for having mystery as part of her life. And in some way now, he re-envisages Rachel, right? The unknown woman. Right? I'm just dropping a heavy hint here. The unknown woman. when he says meta alai Rachel, as if now in some sense I understand. I understand what I didn't get before. Have a look at what's at the end of, at the leopards in the temple. Do you have that? Yes. Leopards, this is Kafka. Leopards break into the temple and drink to the dregs what is in the sacrificial pitchers. This is repeated over and over again. Finally, it can be calculated in advance, and it becomes part of the ceremony. Uncanny scenario. It's all one sentence, you notice, with colons. Yeah. It's one in one breath, he says. On the one hand, first there's violation. The madness, the wildness, breaks into the sacred place of order, and drinks to the dregs and really violates the libations. If it happens a few times, it becomes part of the ceremony. In some way, it becomes domesticated. And I want to say, that's all I want to say about this, I'll leave it to you. This is good news and bad news. The good news is that the wildness can in some way be somewhat domesticated, and one can make use of it in one's life. It can become a part of life. It can become part of the ceremony. It doesn't have to be so frightening. On the other hand, if you domesticate it, you've lost your leopard. Just what the leopard is, you've lost. And so there is no solution. It's a paradox here. And the paradox is that the leopard is something you devoutly don't want in your ordered world, and at the same time you lose something if you don't allow it in. What are you going to lose? And I want to finish with this strange little midrash that's at the end of your page. Midrash Gadol, number 10. How is Yaakov told that Yosef is alive? How do the brothers do it? The Torah says very simply, they came and they told him, Yosef is alive. And he fainted. Vayafeg libo. He swooned. And then he returns to life and he sees the wagons full of good stuff from Egypt and comes back to the world. That's what it says in the Torah. But the Midrash imagines something more complicated. The rabbis said, the brothers said, well, how are we going to tell him? If we tell him right away, Yosef is alive, maybe his soul will fly away. In other words, the impact of reality, in this case a happy reality, will be enough to blow him away. Again, it'll just be too much. And so they're afraid of this, that somewhere the good news would be traumatic for him. So what did they do? How do you deal with this? So they said to Serach, who was the daughter of Asher. Have you heard of this lady? Mm-hmm. Serach bat Asher. She has a cult following. Yes, there are certain very intriguing midrashim about her. She's the daughter of the brother who is called Asher. Yeah? He has a daughter who is a poet, a musician. She lives forever, or at least for many, many years. Yes, and we're told one or two other little things in occasional midrashim. Decidedly minor figure who is a cult heroine. You know, certain people have discovered her and really think there's a lot to think about here. And so all these knowing brothers who've been through a lot in their lives turn to that. Sorry?
She's not in Torah.
She's not in Torah. I think she's not mentioned at all. I think she's listed. Yes, no, she is listed. She's born between the walls. Strange expression. She's born between the walls of Egypt. It's between here and there, right? Not in a Yeshuv Hadad. In a very half-half place. And here they ask their sister to solve their problem. And what does she do? She goes and she waits until Yaakov is standing in prayer. It's all rather mysterious. She just waits her time. When he's standing there, Shmona Esrei, in prayer. Then she sings a little ditty. It's a little rhyming ditty, like a children's song, with rhymes in it, in a tone of wonder, b'lashon tema, strange word, like a questioning, lilting tone, not the tone of absolute truth. Yosef b'Mitzrayim, yuldu lo al birkayim, Menashe ve'Ephraim. You can hear the rhymes there. Yosef is in Egypt. There have been born upon his knees Menashe and Ephraim. So suddenly knees and Egypt and Ephraim rhyme together. Has nothing to do with common sense. You know, how are you going to interpret that as a serious poem? It's not a serious poem in a certain sense. It's what she says that comes from the world of myth. It comes from the world of the sound of things rather than the meaning of things. A sense of a certain order that's there in spite of everything. It comes out in the rhythm, in the rhyme. And she sings it while he's davening. And when he hears it while he's praying, כשהוא עומד בתפילה, and then he swoons while he's still standing in tefillah. And then he comes to himself afterwards, V'techi ruach Yaakov. His spirit comes back to life, it says in the text of the Torah. And then he sees the wagons full of good things, and he's back in the world of reality, and then he understands that it's true. Now, what is this? And again, I just want to make a brief suggestion. Why does she wait till he's davening? Maybe because when you're davening, you're not supposed to be listening to anything else. He is really be'ader. He's absent now from reality. He is now concentrated on what he's doing. And she comes and gives him a little ditty that clearly is not from the world of reality. It's an artistic creation. It's a little sweet little song. It's very, very, very adorable little song with knees in it and Egypt in it, and all in one thing. So that little song from fantasy, in a way, he hears it and he doesn't hear it. So it slips into his consciousness in the only place that's not defended. There's somewhere everything in him is defended against having the information, hearing the information, and it somehow enters into him, and nevertheless he faints when he realizes when he can't help hearing it in spite of all his defenses, in other words. And it gets through because of Serach's artistic, whimsical, wandering tone, because of the way she does it. And then Yaakov can return to the real world and can accept. In other words, this is the madness. This is the madness in song, in art, in literature, in tefillah. Right? It's somewhere the madness can break through. There, it's a feeling of a breakthrough. It's an interruption of some kind, and the interruption is there in a mode that is bearable, almost bearable, and then he can come back to life afterwards. And so I think this little midrash somewhere gives us a sense that, again, it's the granddaughter. It's the granddaughter who brings him the good news. Right? It's the granddaughter who offers him some kind of antidote to his own fixation on order, on things, on Yishuv Hadad, on having things sane and well balanced, let's say. And that is how Holadah is possible. That is, there's a moment of Holadah. This is a moment in which that safety, which he loves so much, is broken, but it's broken in a way that gets through the defenses, and can make it possible then for something new to happen in Yaakov's life. Thank you. So I wish you Chag Sameach, and just remind you that there's no class next week, and we will meet, those of us who want to, in 2 weeks' time for 2 last sessions. Shabbat Shalom.